My name is the Honorable Lady Lynn Fairchild. However, most people in the Society for Creative Anachronism know me as Linnea. I will answer to either name. And for today, I wanted to explain a little bit about Blackwork Embroidery and introduce you to it. I've been studying Blackwork Embroidery for well over 18 years at this point. I've been doing it since I was about 16 years old. So welcome to my class today. So welcome to my introduction on Blackwork Embroidery. So what is Blackwork? Blackwork is a reversible embroidery stitch, usually done with silk thread on linen. Over the centuries, Blackwork has also been referred to as Holbein stitch, back stitch, Spanish work, festoon stitch, square stitch, or double running stitch. Or it's also known as Mamluk embroidery. By counting the threads, the double running stitch is a series of 2 journeys. On the first journey, the pattern is to work every other stitch. And with that, you will get an in, out, in, out, in, out pattern. Then on the return journey, you fill in all of the blank spots to create one continuous line. So on the return journey, you will go in, out, in, out, in, out, and the finished product looks like a single line. What materials do you need? A slate frame is historically accurate. However, if you want to use just a round frame, not historically accurate, but it's still, you can still work with it. Or you can also use a scroll frame. I personally advise not to do the scroll frame, but that's just personal preference. I've tried a scroll frame before and had difficulty keeping my tension. If you use a circular hoop frame, the problem with that is, again, with your tension, as you move the hoop frame across your fabric, you tend to warp the linen a bit, and then it makes your stitches uneven. Next, after the frame, you need linen fabric. Blackwork could have been done on other fabrics, such as velvet, but it was primarily done on linen. Also, you need silk thread. There were other types of threads used, such as cotton, but very rarely. And I've actually tried using cotton thread before and found it to be quite difficult. The silk thread, if you have a knot in your thread one way, you just pull the knot in the opposite direction and the knot comes right out. It's very easy to work with and it's very pretty. Depending on if you get twisted or untwisted silk thread, you can have an extra shine to it. The cotton thread, I found just if it got twisted up, it got knotted, it was difficult to get the knot out, and it's not as pretty, in my personal opinion. So you've got your slate frame, your fabric, your thread. You also need a needle. Beeswax is optional, but I highly recommend it, at least for the ends of your threads, to help your thread not fray. And you need to decide on the pattern. On the left-hand side is a 16th century Italian sampler from the Victorian Albert Museum. And then on the right-hand side is Jane Bostock's English sampler from 1598, and that is also at the Victorian Albert Museum. One of the nice things with using a sampler is you can sit and pick out which pattern you want to use for your particular item. So if you want to embroider cuffs, I can look at this and I could recreate that specific pattern, or I can use it as inspiration while creating my own pattern. Now, if you're just starting out, I suggest to start with a simple pattern. On the top left-hand side is a pattern from Egypt. It's about circa 13th to 14th century. It is blue silk on linen. I believe it's unbleached linen. And if you look, it's just got a simple line on top. And then right below that is another simple line. And then a little zigzaggy pattern going from the top left, zigzag on the diagonal to the bottom right. And then 2 more straight lines underneath that. fairly simple as far as blackwork patterns go. On the right-hand side is Nicolas Bessey's new model book pattern, which is German. It's from 1568. And with this pattern, it just looks like crosses, one right after the other. Again, fairly simple. With this pattern, unlike the one on the left, the Nicolas Bessey's pattern, you can use probably using just one thread. So you would just go on your first journey, left to right, and then on your return journey, going right to left, and your pattern's done. On the bottom is the portrait of a lady as Saint Lucy by Giovanni Antonio Boltraffio. It's from about 1509, and that's at the, sorry if I mispronounced this, Thyssen Bornemisma Museo Nacional in Madrid, Spain. And as far as blackwork embroidery, I think this is the most simple pattern. If you look right on the edge of her collar, beneath the necklace, you'll see the necklace, a little bit of skin, and then the square neckline of her dress. And right on the edge of that square neckline is a single dashed line. This is from an embroidery book, and on the left-hand side is a page from the embroidery book. It's by Zappino. It was written in August 1529. It's currently at the Met Museum, and I interpreted the acorn pattern. If you look at the very top of the left-hand side of the page, you'll see the acorn pattern, and that's the pattern on the top right. And then in the middle of the page on the left, you'll see it looks like double crosses, kind of going up and then down, up and then down. And I've interpreted that pattern as well, and that's on the bottom right. This is another page from that same book, and I've interpreted the pattern. If you look the second pattern down on the left-hand side, where it looks like two triangles, one upside down and one right side up, and then a little line, and then crosses reflecting off of each other, and then triangles again. That's the pattern on the top right. And then if you count down, see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 patterns down, you'll see it looks like a reflection of crosses on the top and the bottom. That is the pattern that I have interpreted on the bottom right side. This is from an embroidery book from 1530. It is by Tagliente, and it is at the Met Museum. The patterns that I interpreted from this page, the pattern near the top of the page is on the top left-hand side of the page. And then, do you see the double cross pattern on the bottom left? It's about the middle of the page on the right-hand side, that double cross pattern. Let me go back. Do you remember this from 1529? Do you see the pattern on the bottom right from 1529 by Zappino? Yet Tagliente did it in 1530. At this time, if you look at certain books, you'll find that they reused the ink presses for different books. They just shuffled up the pages. That's also why if you look in recipe books from this time period, you will find the recipes might be the same. They've just been put in a different order, added in a couple new recipes, and voila, they have a new book. This is an embroidered sampler at the Met Museum. It's from about 1600, and the pattern that I am interpreted on this page is inside the red circle. It's near the top right-hand side of the sampler, and I've enhanced the embroidery on the top right of the page. And this is an example where you can see some of the stitches are missing, but because it's counted stitch, you can count the threads where they're missing and fill in the line and create the pattern, which I've interpreted and created below. This is from the same sampler, and inside the red circle on the left-hand side is the pattern I interpreted. On the right-hand side is an enhanced picture of that pattern, and again, some of the threads are missing, but because it's counted stitch, we can count where the stitches are missing and find what the pattern would have looked like, and that's what I've put on the bottom right-hand side of the page. From the same Italian sampler, inside the red circle is the pattern that I've enhanced in the middle of the page, and then I've interpreted it and put it on the right-hand side. This particular one, if you notice, some of the threads don't line up quite neatly, and so you can actually count the stitches, because instead of being one continuous line, you'll see where the threads tend to sit next to each other in the same hole, and that helps with counting how many holes in between each stitch, as well as how many stitches per section of the pattern. And this is still the same Italian sampler we've been looking at, and inside the red circle on the top left-hand corner is the pattern that I recreated on the right-hand side. I've enhanced the picture, and then beneath that, because on the sampler it just had that one, what would you call it, cornstalk, but there was only one, but because of the line at the bottom, this is a pattern that you can add and add and add and create trim around, say, a collar or a cuff. So for the pattern on the bottom, I've put 3 side by side. And from the same embroidered sampler, inside the red circle near the top of the sampler, I have enhanced that picture and then recreated the pattern below. This is another example where the threads are missing in part of the pattern. Actually, if you look near the bottom left corner of the picture in the middle, you'll actually see the thread sitting up on top of the sampler. But this is because it's counted stitch. You can fill in the dots. Think of it like connect the dots. You can fill in the blank spaces and recreate the pattern that was on the sampler. And still the same Italian sampler. Inside the red circle, I've enhanced the picture, and this is very much a case of connect the dots, because half the thread is missing. Again, it's counted stitch, so you can count the threads where they're missing and recreate the pattern. And that's what I've done on the bottom right-hand side, is a recreation of the pattern that is found on this Italian sampler. And still working with the same Italian sampler, there were many patterns on this sampler, so it's a great piece to look at. And I've enhanced the picture on the right-hand side and then recreated the pattern below. And once again, if you look on the far right-hand side of the enhanced picture, you'll see part of the threads are missing, but because it's a mirror image from the left side to the right side, you can still recreate that image when creating your pattern. And still working with the same embroidered sampler, I've enhanced the picture on the right-hand side and recreated the pattern below. And here's one more example of a pattern from that embroidered sampler, and I've recreated the pattern, posted it below, and I have even more patterns from this sampler. If you would like to see more patterns, please visit the website on the top left-hand side. Other examples of Italian blackwork from the 16th century is this embroidered fabric. It is at the Museo del Tessuto. If I mispronounced that, please correct me. Inside the red circle on the left-hand side, I have recreated that pattern and put that pattern on the right-hand side. And on that same sampler, you'll see it has a flower inside the red circle, and then I've recreated that pattern and put that on the right side as well. I have other patterns from this sampler. Please follow the link on the top left-hand side. This is an enhanced picture of a much larger sampler at the V&A Museum. It's from the 16th century. And inside the red circle on the bottom right-hand side of the picture on the left, I have included the 2 patterns that are there, and they're in the middle and the bottom right of the page. Now that we're done with Italian, let's work with a little bit with English embroidery. This is a popular sampler. It is Jane Bostock's sampler from 1598. It's at the V&A Museum, and this is the sampler on the left-hand side. And inside the red circle is the enhanced picture that I have in the middle, and then on the right-hand side is my interpretation of that pattern. This is a painting of Margaret Roper. She was the oldest daughter of the oldest daughter of Sir Thomas More. Her maiden name was Margaret More, and then got married and became Margaret Roper. This painting was done about 1535 to 1536, and it's at the Met Museum. This is another way of finding blackwork patterns. Instead of just simply studying samplers that exist, you can also go to paintings, and especially the Holbein paintings. You can look at some museums, you can enhance the painting and figure out the pattern. You may not be able to count the stitches like you can on an actual sampler, where you can count the missing threads or the number of holes between a stitch, but you can still get the concept of the pattern. And then depending on if it's a sleeve with a really large pattern, if it's a collar with a smaller pattern, you can kind of guesstimate if it was every third hole for a stitch or if it was every fifth hole for a stitch if it's a larger pattern. So with this painting of Margaret, I have enhanced her collar in the middle picture, and then I have included my interpretation of that pattern of her collar on the bottom right-hand side. This is a miniature painting of Elizabeth, Lady Audley from about 1538. It's with the Royal Collection Trust. And with this one, you can see right along the trim, right around the edge of her dress, she's got, it looks like blackwork trim, but because it's a miniature, I'm sure it was difficult to get all the brush strokes just exactly right to get the pattern, but the painter got the basic idea of the pattern. And with that, I recreated what I think the pattern looks like, and that's on the bottom right-hand side. And this is from a sampler at the V&A Museum. It's by, I believe her first name was Sarah Blake. It was done in 1664. And as you can see on the left-hand side, it is very long, very detailed, lots of patterns to study, which is why I color-coded the different patterns so you can have an idea of where to find this specific pattern on this sampler. And this is a case where you can go to the museum website, enhance the picture, and zoom in and actually be able to count the stitches for that pattern. And I have other patterns from this sampler. If you would like to see more patterns from this sampler, please visit my blog. The link is below on the right-hand side. This is, it was done by a German painter. It's Holbein, Hans Holbein the Younger. But I've included it with the English paintings because even though the painting is labeled as Portrait of a Boy with a Marmoset, it's labeled as being from about 1532 to 1535. It's located at the Kunstmuseum. But with this portrait, you will find, if you look up, just do a Google search and look up Edward VI, you will find this painting associated with him. But if you look up Henry Fitzroy, you might also find this painting associated with him. No one knows for sure who this boy is. That's why the painting in the museum is just labeled as being Portrait of a Boy with a Marmoset. But they have it between 1532 to 1535, which to me automatically rules out that it could be Edward VI, because Edward VI wasn't born yet. If memory serves correctly, he was born in 1537, because Anne Boleyn died in 1536. That is when Henry VIII, King Henry VIII, the famous king with 6 wives of England, married his third wife, Jane Seymour, in 1536. She soon became pregnant and then gave birth in 1537 to Edward, who later became Edward VI. But depending on other websites you look at, I have found some websites that associate the year 1541 to this picture. So if he was born in 1537, there might be that chance in 1541 that this could be him, but I still think he looks older than that. If it's Henry Fitzroy, there is a better chance of that because Henry Fitzroy was the illegitimate son born to Bessey Blount, the one recognized illegitimate child that Henry VIII was willing to recognize. And Henry Fitzroy was born in 1519. So if he was born in 1519 and this was painted between 1532 to 1535, then this, to me, looks more like a boy who could be 12, 13, 14, not a boy who hasn't been born yet or a boy who's barely 5. But regardless of which boy it is, if you look at the collar, you can enhance the picture, which I've done on the right-hand side, and you'll see there's like a little ocean wave picture with a line on the bottom and a line on the top. And I've recreated that pattern on the bottom right-hand side. This is an example of late Tudor period blackwork, and as you can see, instead of having the geometric designs that Egyptian blackwork has, the Tudor blackwork actually has more circular floral motifs. Here are more examples of blackwork embroidery. On the left-hand side, you will see Bess of Hardwick sleeves from about 1550. And if you notice, it's not black. Remember how I mentioned earlier about red work? Red work is Holbein stitch done in red rather than black thread. On the right-hand side are Jane Seymour's cuffs from about 1636. And as you can see, it's painted by Hans Holbein, which is where you get the name the Holbein stitch, because Hans Holbein specifically was really good about painting different portraits with the blackwork detail. In fact, he painted miniatures that have the blackwork detail, and it's so detailed that when you blow up the miniature on your computer and you blow up the image, you can actually sit there and count the threads and recreate the pattern from a little miniature portrait. Personally, I think that's pretty cool. As a side note, in case you're curious who Jane Seymour is, Jane Seymour was the third wife of King Henry VIII. She's the one who died in childbirth about, a little over a year after marrying Henry VIII. Now on to Portuguese embroidery. This is a page from a booklet of embroidery and drawn work. It's from the 17th century and it's at the Met Museum. And the particular pattern on this page that I have interpreted is inside the red circle on the left-hand side. And I've flipped the picture so it's sitting parallel rather than perpendicular to the ground. It's on the right-hand side. And this is a really good case of, if you look at the lines on the top right side, the picture on the top right side, you'll see on the line, you'll see dark dots every so often. That tells you every dark dot is a stitch. So even though we can't zoom in enough to count the holes in between each stitch, you can tell how many stitches, like if you look on the top of one of those bubbles, or if you want to call it a curve, on top of one of those curves, there are 4 dots. That tells you 4 dots, that's 1 stitch, 2 stitch, 3 stitch, and then you go back down on the curve. So I was able to recreate the pattern on the bottom right side. This is an example of German embroidery. It is from a German embroidery book from 1597, written by Siebenmacher. And although this is not a blackwork pattern, the pattern on the right side was inspired by the pattern on the left because it was from an embroidery book and it is a German pattern. So you can use patterns that existed for, say, brick stitch, and if you want to use it to inspire you to create a blackwork pattern. This is a painting at the Kunsthistorisches Museum. It was painted in 1531, and this is an example of where you can zoom in on the collar and you can study the pattern and recreate it. Can you count the stitches? No, but you can get a basic idea of what the pattern looks like and then recreate it, which I've done on the bottom right side. This is an example of embroidery from the Netherlands. This is a portrait of a young woman from about 1535. It's currently at the Met Museum. And this, if you look at the painting, you can zoom in, you can see blackwork along her collar, along the top part of her shirt, but also along her sleeves and around the cuffs. The problem is, as you zoom in, the pattern starts to become blurred, as you can see on the right-hand side. So it's not perfect, it's not as good as the Holbein paintings, but you can still get a basic concept of what the pattern looks like, which I've recreated on the bottom right side. And for some other embroidery, have you heard of Kasuti Embroidery? Here is an example on the right-hand side from Kasuti Patterns, and it is Indian embroidery, which looks, oddly enough, like Egyptian embroidery or Blackwork embroidery, or we can call it Holbein stitch, reversible stitch. It's all the same thing. It's counted stitch that is reversible on both sides. Well, most times reversible on both sides. Kasuti embroidery dates back to the, if I mispronounce this, I'm sorry, please correct me, Chalukya period from the 6th to the 12th centuries in India. So if you like blackwork embroidery, I highly recommend checking out this embroidery. So slate frames. This wooden style of frame has 4 perpendicular sides with pegs or notches to help keep the fabric secure. Of the 4 perpendicular sides, there are 2 with mortises and 2 with tenons. A mortise is the hole that another piece of wood slides through. The tenon is a piece of wood being slid through the mortise, which is the hole. So if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, the mortise is the hole, so that would be the 2 bars that are on the top and the bottom. The sides have the holes in them, and then the tenons, those are the 2 that go up and down, so they go through the 2 that are vertical, or sorry, horizontal. This type of frame can be fixed to trestles. It can have an independent foot, or it can be handheld. A slate frame helps to keep the fabric taut, which means it keeps it very tight, while it is being embroidered, which allows for even stitches and it does not warp the fabric. Here are a few examples of slate frames in history. On the left-hand side is an illumination from the 14th century, and it shows a slate frame being propped up with feet, and that is at the British Library. And on the right-hand side is a painting of the Virgin Mary with the child Jesus. Mary is using a tapestry slate frame, and the frame is fixed and set up on trestles. That painting is from 1440, and it's at the Bibliothèque in France. Here are a few more examples of slate frames. On the left is a slate frame. It has legs, and if you zoom in on the picture, you can also see it has the mortises as well as the plugs on the sides to keep it in the shape that it needs to be in. And that painting is from 1470. On the right-hand side is an etching, and that was etched in 1532 by Alessandro. If I mispronounce this, I'm sorry, please correct me. Paganino? We'll go with that. Here are some more slate frames. On the left-hand side is an example of silk embroidery being done on a slate frame in 1568, and that is from a German book called if I mispronounced this, I'm sorry, the Standardbook. On the right-hand side is a similar frame construction as we've seen in previous centuries, the same type of frame with the fabric stretched and then stitched onto the wooden frame, and then it's held up by trestles or by legs. And this is also a German engraving, and it is from 1698. Also the Standardbook, written by 2 different authors, 2 different centuries, but still the same type of embroidery frame. And more historical examples of slate frames. On the left-hand side is an engraving. It's by Jan, I will probably mispronounce this, Sweelink. It's from 1627, and it's called Stitcher with Cupid. And with this, if you look, it's a slate frame, but there are no trestles. She's just holding it, and it looks like Cupid is on the other side helping her hold it and helping her with the stitching. On the right-hand side is an example of a very large embroidery frame. Actually, there are two very large embroidery frames, and this is from 1770. If you look closely, you can see the one frame on the right-hand side is so large that there are two women sitting on either side of the frame doing the embroidery. And this is a large example of a slate frame being propped up by trestles. And more slate frames in history. On the left-hand side is a painting from 1720, and if you can see on the frame, again, she's got the fabric, and then it's stitched around on all four sides to hold the fabric in place and keep it nice and tight. An example of a slate frame today is on the left-hand side, and as you can see, you've got the mortises, you've got the tenons, and then there are the four little pegs. On this picture, you can only see the two on the top. Those are the little metal pieces, the little metal pegs that go into the holes that hold the bar exactly where you want it to keep the fabric nice and tight on all four sides. And then after that, you can stitch anything like bias tape onto the edge of the fabric, and then sew the bias tape and sew that onto the wood. On the right-hand side is an example of just your traditional adjustable hoop frame. And like I said, with a hoop frame, you actually have two hoops, one on the bottom and one that's a little bit larger on top. And then the one that's on top, you adjust to how tight you can get it. So that way your fabric sits in there, it's nice and tight inside that hoop. The only problem is by putting your fabric into that hoop, the fabric will then get the impression of that hoop. So when you take the hoop off, especially if it's like linen fabric that you're using, it will still show that circular spot where the hoop had been. What type of needle do you use? If you look on the left-hand side, there's an enhanced portrait of Costanza. I'll probably mispronounce this, and please correct me if I do mispronounce this, Costanza Cantani. And that's also from the late 1400s. And in that portrait, you see her with pins, a thimble, and sewing needle. For my black work, I usually just typically use the same type of needle like what you would use in today's modern cross stitch. But that's what I use. On the right-hand side of the screen, you will see Viking era needles, and that's from Coppergate. The one thing you have to make sure of is if the eye of your needle is larger than the pointy end of your needle, then that might warp the linen a bit. So you want a needle that is about as straight as possible, where the eye is not any bigger than the rest of the needle. That way it doesn't warp the thread at all and warp your fabric at all and create holes in your fabric. You also want to use a very thin needle for the same reason. What type of silk thread? I recommend using, and I'll probably mispronounce this, soy perle. This is a twisted silk thread that only needs beeswax applied to the ends of the threads. There is also the soy ovale. If I mispronounced that, please let me know. And the soy ovale is an untwisted silk thread. This thread is shinier than the soy perle, but it also frays a lot more. I can show you examples of that later in this class. So the soy ovale is shinier and prettier looking, but with that one, you really want to use the beeswax on it because it will fray, and the backside, it will look like a mess after a while. For Egyptian threads, blue, red, and brown, the brown could be faded black, or common embroidery threads used in pre-15th century Egypt embroidery. The brown threads that we see in examples in museums may have originally been black, since the iron used to dye the threads can fade over time as well as erode the thread. Black silk thread on white linen was definitely the most popular and the most favored in Europe. Red thread was occasionally used, as we saw previously in Bess of Hardwick's sleeves. In England, gold and silver threads were also used. However, a person had to be careful when using gold or silver threads due to the sumptuary laws. Among the restrictions listed in Elizabeth I 1574 statute was that for gold, silver, or pearl embroidery, it was reserved for only dukes, marquises, earls, including the children of all three, viscounts, barons, and knights of the garter. Can Gutermann silk thread be used? Gutermann silk thread can be purchased at Joann Fabrics or any local fabric store. It's machine washable, and it's a nice thread to begin learning blackwork on, especially if you can buy it cheaply with a coupon. I know Joann Fabrics a lot of times has like a 40% off coupon, which makes the Gutermann silk thread ideal as a learning tool. Plus, it's machine washable. For example, if you look on the bottom right in that picture, those are cups I made for my son's shirt when he was, I believe, 4 years old. He was still able to fit in that shirt when he turned 6, and he did youth combat in the SCA wearing that shirt. Now you can just imagine how much sweat and dirt went into that linen shirt that he wore. And because I used Gutermann silk thread on that shirt, I was able to machine wash it and keep it white, amazingly. However, as far as using Gutermann silk thread or not using Gutermann silk thread, if you're aiming for historical accuracy or you want a more bold thread, then I would not recommend using this. The Gutermann silk thread tends to be very thin, and so you can see it up close, to see the pattern, but as you step away, you cannot see the person's pattern as easily because it is very thin. And also, like I said, for historical accuracy, you would want a bold thread. That way, when you're standing more than 6 feet away from someone, they can still see the embroidery and actually see the pattern, and then they can compliment you on, wow, look at that pattern. What items were embroidered? The Moorish embroidery had been used to decorate various household items such as towels, napkins, and cushion covers, as well as garments such as robes and veils. In Europe, clothes were embroidered, such as shirt sleeves, ruffs, cuffs, coifs, doublets, nightcaps, falling bands, along with handkerchiefs. Part of this was to do embroidery. It takes a lot of time, especially if you are doing blackwork embroidery on sleeves, on the fourth part of a skirt. That takes a lot of time. And so they like to wear their wealth. And if you can afford to just simply sit there and do embroidery all day, then that means you have lots of luxury. You have extra time on your hands. And so aside from your pearls, your velvets, your furs, depending on your station, you would also show off the blackwork embroidery. Yes, first you want to weave your thread in and out through the fabric. Typically I work left to right, and I count approximately every 3rd or 5th hole per stitch in the linen fabric. Later I can show you the differences between every 3rd hole and every 5th hole, because that will then determine how small or how big your pattern is. And once you are at the end of the line, then the return journey begins, and that's where you fill in the spaces. And then when you are done, you want to weave the tail of the thread into the pattern on the underneath side. You also do this at the very beginning when you start off. So when you start off, you'll have a little bit of the tail on the underneath side, and you'll just weave it into the pattern as you go left to right, and then return, and then the end of your thread gets woven in at the same place your tail was. If you're in the middle of a pattern, you might be able to split it, part on the left, part on the right, but I can get into more of that later. Another option is to tie a knot at the end of your thread. However, if you do tie a knot, there are a couple of issues you may want to know about. One, depending on how big or how small you tie your knot, if it's small and you machine wash your fabric, that knot may pull through the fabric and now you've lost part of your pattern. The other thing is if you want your pattern to be completely reversible on both sides, depending on how many stitches your pattern was, where your knot is may not be at the exact starting place as where your thread started. So on the underneath side, you might have a knot here and a knot here and a space in between where there should be another stitch. Again, personal preference. I have known some people to knot their threads and they like to do it. I just recommend testing out and see what works for you. On the picture here, you will see at the very top, the pattern is that simple line that I mentioned on the last screen. That was on the square neckline. It's just a single line. And so to start off, here you have the dashed look of in, out, in, out, in, out. And then when you get to the end of your, whatever it is you're embroidering, the end of your cuff, collar, whatever, then you start your return journey. And now you go back, right to left, back to where you began. And again, you do the in, out pattern. And in the end, you have a complete picture. So again, what do you do with the end of your thread? On the far left-hand side, you can see where I had just done a quick sampler. And on that sampler, I was testing out different silk threads. The very top thread is the Gutermann silk thread. And then the middle, I believe that one was the untwisted silk thread. And then the third one down was the twisted silk thread. That's the differences between the soie ovale and the soie perlée. But I was also testing out the differences between beeswax on all of the thread, just on the tail ends, or no beeswax at all. That's why there's 3 sections of 3. But for my quick sampler, you can see where I wove the tail ends into the underneath side of the pattern. If you want to try to be a little more neat, in the center section, or the center picture, it's the backside of a sampler by Elizabeth Burton, about 1701. So I know that's out of the time period for the SCA because we only go up to the 16th century. But anyways, the backside of this sampler, it's from 1701. It's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But as you can see, you can see where some of the tail ends are, but for the most part, to me, this looks fairly neat and pretty. On the right-hand side is a collar I had done, and that is with the soie ovale silk thread. And with that, there's no beeswax on the tail ends of the fabric or on the thread, and that's where I learned the hard way to use beeswax on the tail ends of your thread. Remember that sampler where I mentioned the differences between using beeswax and not using beeswax, and the differences between the Gutermann silk thread and the soie ovale and the soie perlée? Here's that sampler. So if you look, this is the Gutermann silk thread, and then the untwisted, and then the twisted silk thread, and then this section has no beeswax. This section just has beeswax on the end, and then this one, it has beeswax throughout. But like as I move back, you can see the twisted and the untwisted are still pretty bold, whereas the Gutermann silk thread is starting to fade away because, well, it's a thin thread. The differences between the third hole and every fifth hole. This is a sampler. Remember that 16th century Italian sampler I talked about? These are patterns from that sampler. And if you look, oh, I'm on the back side too. If you look, this is every third hole on the whole sampler. This is a coif I made for my daughter, and I believe it has 88 diamonds. Each diamond with a flower in the middle took me about 20 minutes to do, and this is every fifth hole. So to show you the size difference, this is every fifth hole on the flower, and this one on the left is every third hole. So that's the differences between the sizing. So if you're doing something small like a collar or a cuff, I recommend doing every third hole. You'll find it's also easier to weave your tail in back into the fabric on the underneath side if you do every third hole. If you're doing something larger like sleeves or the forepart to a skirt, you probably want to do every fifth hole, otherwise you'll be at it all day long. As far as whether to do every third hole, every fifth hole on historical accuracy, I think that was just more or less personal preference, because a lot of the patterns that we look at that we can find are in portraits, such as Holbein's portraits. And we can find the pattern, we can recreate the pattern, but we can't tell just by looking at the painting if it's every third hole or every fifth hole. Remember how I mentioned learning the hard way about using beeswax, at least on the ends of your silk threads? On the Gutermann silk thread, you don't need the beeswax, but if you use the soie ovale or the soie perlée or any other silk thread like that, you'll want to use beeswax at least on the end. Here is a partlet that I stitched, and on the underneath side is the untwisted without any beeswax, and in sections of it you can start to see where it's fraying. Let me see if that zooms in. So you can see where it's fraying right there. So again, use the beeswax.
Find your starting place. And with any pattern, I personally prefer to work from the top left corner and work my way down and across like you would with writing. That's my personal preference, because you will be going from one side to the other, doing a dotted line, and then you'll be going back and filling in your dotted line. Now, some people put a knot on the end of their thread. I personally like to weave my tail in. That's personal preference. So from here, I've pulled my thread through. I've got my tail back here. And now I'm going to go down. I'm actually going to skip one hole on this and go to the next hole. So my pattern is going to be every other hole. And then as I pull this through on the front, I want to make sure that my tail gets pulled in underneath, and then I'm going to skip one hole and go to the next hole, like that. And then I'm going to pull it tight. Make sure your tail is woven in. There we go. And then back on the top, skip one hole and go to the second hole. And then pull it through. Now at this point, make sure you want to keep your thread taut, but you don't want to pull it so tightly that you pull your entire thread out. That's part of the reason why you're weaving the tail into the backside, to secure your thread. So from here, I've skipped one hole and I'm going to the second hole, and I'm making sure my tail is woven in, and I'm going to pull it tight like that. And then back on the front side. And with this pattern, I'm just going to do a straight line across and back to give you the basic idea of how to do this. So skip one hole and go to the next hole and pull it through. And then on the back side, skip one hole and go to the next hole And I'm going to make sure my tail is still woven in. And from here, I'm going to flip it to the front and pull tight. And you want to make sure the tail is still woven in. Now again, some people like to put a knot at the very end. My personal preference is to weave it in, but that's just because one time I did put a knot at the end and the linen was white enough that when I went to wash it, the knot pulled through, which meant I lost some of my embroidery. So that's why I prefer to weave the tail in. So again, skipping one hole and going to the next hole and pulling it through. And as you can see, my tail is still being woven in. As far as the length of the tail, I would give yourself at least 1 inch to 1.5 inches. Part of that depends also on how small or how big you are making your embroidery. What I mean, for example, on this sampler, this is black silk on linen, and every stitch is every 3rd hole on the linen. But to give you an idea, on these two, the stitch is every 5th hole, so it's bigger. To give you an idea, this flower type and this flower type are almost identical. The difference is this flower on the petal here just has a little dent that goes in the middle. But otherwise, this flower, dimension-wise, is the same as this flower. But you can see the size difference between every 3rd hole and every 5th hole. So if it's every 3rd or 4th hole, every 3rd hole, you can get away with 1 inch tail. But if it's every 5th hole, then I would definitely go more for 1.5 to 2 inches of a tail. If you want to do every 4th hole, that's also personal preference. For me to just do every 3rd or 5th hole, it just depends on how big or how small you want your piece. For example, if you're just embroidering a coif, then you could go for a smaller pattern. Just the same if you are embroidering an entire front part to a skirt or sleeves, then you may want to go with every 5th hole. So now that I've gone in and out, in and out, in and out, as you can see, I've created a dashed line. If this was the end of my line, this is the end of my first journey, then I want to go back the way I came and fill in my holes. So from there, I'm just going to go in and fill in the dashed lines. And this is also where you want to make sure to weave your tail in. So that way it's woven in both on the first journey and the second journey. And thinking of materials as far as the type of needle to use, personally, I just use whatever needle I happen to have. Usually it's a needle that I've used from a cross-stitch pattern. You'll find needles that have a sharper point they poke through the linen fabric, but can also sometimes snag the fabric, so you have to be careful with that. Just the same, if you have a needle that's dull on the edge, it won't snag the fabric, but sometimes it's slightly more difficult to poke it through the linen. And now you can see I've created one solid line. Now if I wanted to do something of a pattern, like for example, say I wanted to do this pattern right here. Personally, what I do is I study my pattern and figure out how many spaces there are in between each little figure. So at this, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces in between each figure. So just for teaching purposes, I'm not starting a new thread. I'm just going to use the same one that I have and find a new starting spot down below. So with this, I want to do every 5th space. I'm going to continue just doing as I was and doing every other hole. So I'm skipping 1 and going 1 down. So that's 1. Skipping a hole and going up the next one. That's 2. 3. 4. If I can find it, there we go. 4. And 5. Now that I've got my 5 spaces, now it's time to do my little figure. And so from here, if I can bring this up close. By the way, this is a 16th century pattern. Specifically, it's Italian. I'm going to go up diagonally twice to the right. So diagonally up twice, and then one goes up, over, and down. The other goes up, over, and to the side. So I said diagonally twice to the right, going up, so going to skip 1 hole and go to the next hole, like that. And then pull it tight. This is the back side, and here's the front side. So now you can't see that dashed line, but the next one you will find. So skip 1 hole and go in through the next. And now I'm going to go up 1, so skip 1 hole and go to the next, go up. And then over. And down. And now I'm going to retrace my steps going back the way I came. So I'm going to go up. And then over. And down. So with that, I've got the top portion of this. Let me see if I'll zoom in here. So I've got the top portion, and now I'm going to do the bottom portion. Or actually, I guess it's the side portion. So from here, I'm going to go over to the right. Down. And over, and now I'm going to go back the way I came, going back over, up, over, and at this point I'm just retracing my steps, doing the second journey, filling in this space. And now I'm back to the original line. And now if I want to continue my pattern, I'm going to continue going to the right. And I'm going to count 5 spaces over. So that's 2, 3, 4, 5. And now is when you want to go up and diagonally to the right again. So up, and up again, And then here's where you go straight up and then over to the left and then down. And then I'm retracing my steps, going up, over, and back down. And now I'm going over to the right. Going down, and now I'm going over to the left. And then I'm retracing my steps, going on that second journey. The goal is to make this reversible, so that way it looks the same on both sides. And that way it should hopefully resemble lace. Well, that's if you're doing more 16th century embroidery. And then if I want to continue, just do 5 more spaces. So that's 2, 3, 4, and 5. And now if I'm done with my pattern, say this is a collar and I've gone from one edge to the other, and now I want to fill in my spaces for the second journey, just go back the way I came. And as you can see, the dashed lines are filling in and becoming reversible. Now I recommend using, this is cross stitch fabric. I recommend using that first to practice on, to figure out what you're doing and how you're going to do it. Once you've got a knack for this, then that's when I would suggest to move to linen. Just because with this, it's a lot easier to see the holes and figure out your pattern than it is to automatically go straight to the linen. Now I've finished my line. It's reversible, but as you can see, I've got a space here, but I still have to fill in this space here. So normally what I would do is I would loop this around and then weave my tail in and out before I cut my thread. So from here, I'm just going to weave it in the same as you did at the very beginning, giving your tail about an inch or so. So from here, I'm just going in from the right side and coming out the left side. And just weaving the tail in. And once I'm done weaving the tail in to my satisfaction, it's time to you want to cut it as close as you can to the line without hurting your fabric or the thread. And see, now it looks reversible. First, I like to come up with my pattern. And this right here is the 1598 English Sampler by Jane Bostock. And I've decided to use the pattern here for part of my pattern today. So if you can see, it looks like it's a braided pattern and it makes a diamond right through here. Now for the center of my pattern, I decided to, if I scroll over here, if you can see, there's a flower here, and there's also a flower here and a flower here. It's all the same flower, and I've decided to incorporate that into the middle of my pattern. And here is my pattern. Here is that braided diamond, and then I've put the flower in the middle. Now, if you're curious how I was able to come up with this pattern on the computer, I was able to count the stitches over here, and then I went to Excel, and up here right underneath font, if you select that and click draw border, and then from here I can create patterns, as I will show you right here. You can click and create whatever pattern you want.
After you've embroidered your piece, then attach it to your garment. On the left-hand side, you will see where I embroidered the cuffs and the collar for a shirt, and then I cut it off of the slate frame and I attached it to a shirt for my husband.